The Audacity to Podcast is back, and I've got even more exciting news to share with you. Thank you for joining me for the Audacity to Podcast. I'm Daniel J. Lewis. Yes, the Audacity to Podcast is back. And before jumping back into the content to help you grow and improve your podcast, especially with that episode that I've been promising for months now on how to refresh your podcast branding, and I've got another episode already prepared about what to do when you have a duplicate podcast listing in Apple Podcasts, because it's a complicated mess that should not be that complicated, but it is now because of iTunes 14.5 and later versions. It's a mess. Just don't do anything yet until you listen to that episode if you're in that situation. But those episodes are coming very soon because the Audacity to Podcast is back. But before that, I want to share some things that I'm really excited about, and I hope you will be too. Number one, the Audacity to Podcast won a podcast award. Yes, the People's Choice Podcast Awards, started by Todd Cochrane, is the longest running podcast awards. And it's over at podcastawards.com. I was surprised back in 2012 when the Audacity to Podcast won Best Technology Podcast. And I was there in Las Vegas at New Media Expo. Wow, that's a blast from the past. And the ceremony was hosted live by Leo Laporte. It was such a huge joy and honor to be handed the trophy by Leo Laporte because he is one of my podcasting heroes and inspirations. He hosts the first podcast I ever listened to and inspired me in many ways to start my own podcast. So to be handed the award by him was such an honor. And I was so surprised back then that I didn't really know what to say. But for this year, the way that we had to do it was we all had to pre-record our acceptance speeches because the ceremony is pre-produced. So I did have something to say this time. And here is that speech. As most of my amazing audience knows, the last few years have been very difficult for me. But many of my audience, many of you were still there for me, and you even kept me in your podcast apps. Thank you. I named my show The Audacity to Podcast because it takes audacity to think that you can impact the world with only your voice from literally your closet. It takes courage to speak up for what's right. It takes guts to put out your message and dare to compete with men and women who may have far more skills and resources than you. But you do, and we do it because of the burning passion inside us. That's why I started the Audacity to Podcast more than 12 years ago, to give you the guts and teach you the tools to start and grow your own podcast for passion and profit. However you define profit for yourself and your audience. I'm so very grateful for my audience, for their support, for the talented people I get to work with, for the celebration of my contributions to the podcasting industry, and most of all, for the sustaining grace from Jesus Christ. We can make a difference, no matter our microphones, our messages, or our methods. Why? Because we have the audacity to podcast. And as a podcaster who podcasts about podcasting and is speaking to mostly podcasters now, I would be remiss without reminding you to listen to my podcast at theaudacitytopodcast.com. I'm Daniel J. Lewis, and from the bottom of my heart, thank you. And it is truly an honor. And thank you. I feel like I can't say that enough times. Thank you. If you supported me in the awards, you told other people to support me or anything like that, thank you so much. Now, you can watch the video of that if you want to. In the notes for this episode, I've embedded it and linked to it from there. And you get to see my new video studio setup there, which is kind of in a little bit of a draft mode with the setup, but I kind of like the way it looks. It's very black. So if you're like inner Lego Batman like I am, where you only work in black and sometimes very, very dark gray, then you'll love this new setup with very black backgrounds, black reflections, colored LED lights, and then me in the middle. So you can check that out. It's in the notes for this episode, a tap or swipe away inside your podcast app. Number 2, Podgagement has finally launched. You might be wondering, what is Podgagement and why should I care? This is the product that I started creating more than 4 years ago. And in the process of creating it, then I discovered new data that I spun off into another product called podcastindustryyinsights.com. Podgagement is a revolutionary upgrade of my podcast reviews. It is now called Podgagement, and it does so much more than my podcast reviews did. My podcast reviews was really mostly about podcast reviews. It was right there in the title. but Podgagement is about engagement. Again, it's right there in the title. This service carries over all the review tracking features of my podcast reviews, but adds a whole lot more to focus on helping you engage your audience and grow your podcast. Thus, the new name, Podgagement. And by the way, is it really a podcasting product if it doesn't have pod or cast somewhere in the name? Podgagement brings all new features and a whole new feature tier with even more benefits. In short, everything from my podcast reviews has been migrated to the new Astro tier. So if you were on my podcast reviews before, you've been automatically migrated over. All the branding has been moved over. Billing, all of that has been moved over. You still get those same features. Or if you're looking for my podcast reviews, everything will redirect now to Podgagement. Your same login details, all of that is still there. But it's a rebrand and more on top of that. So all those ratings and review features are in the Astro tier and some new features too, like some great new charts, some really cool new abilities that you have with your love and follow pages and more coming in the future. And the brand new Constellation tier offers even more new features. Some of these Constellation exclusive features include collecting voice and written feedback from your audience. So you don't need something like SpeakPipe or one of those other services like that anymore. You could use Podgagement for that. You get a nice speakable URL, like you had a lovethepodcast.com and followthepodcast.com URL. You now have a castfeedback.com URL if you are on the Constellation tier. And you can use that to collect the voice and written feedback from your audience, and it appears right there in your Podgagement account, along with other engagement that's being tracked by Podgagement. Another feature that you get in the Constellation tier is tracking what I call in-app podcast networking through recommendations, the Podcasting 2.0 Podroll feature, and more coming in the future. This is when you go into Apple Podcasts, you see probably near the bottom of your podcast, a list of other podcasts, like a you might also like sort of thing. Those are algorithmically generated, and they show that these other podcasts are somewhat similar to yours and, most importantly, have crossover audience. So that's why it's the whole you might also like, or kind of like the customers who bought this also bought that kind of thing that you see in many stores. It's the same thing here inside of Apple Podcasts. Well, I'm tracking that. So you can see those podcasts that are listed on your podcast, but even more exciting, I'm tracking all the other podcasts that have your podcast listed as recommended on their podcast listing. So you can use this for all kinds of things, like guesting opportunities. They could be a guest on your podcast. You could be a guest on their podcast. You could collaborate with them. You could cross-promote with them, all of these things. So that's why this is called the networking feature, because what can you do with this? You can network with your peers. You can grow each other and help each other in great ways. I'm really excited about this feature. So the voice and written feedback feature and the networking feature are already available in the Constellation tier of Podgagement. And then coming in the future will be other things like tracking your chart position in Apple Podcasts in all the countries, in all the categories, similar to some of the other services out there that have tracked that for years. Well, I've been tracking the charts for years. The database is huge now. I've just not been able to do anything with it. That's coming in the future to be able to track that. But not only the charts, like the top podcasts, but also some of the special featured sections, like new and noteworthy or what's hot or some of the trending sections. And it will be in Apple Podcasts and some of the other podcast apps in the future too. That's coming in the future, as well as in-app SEO tracking, some AI-powered audience engagement enhancements, some monetization features, and more. So most of these new features are coming to the Constellation tier, but the Astro tier is getting new features as well and already has some fun new features in it. You can read more about the launch of Podgagement in the announcement post that I linked to in the notes for this episode. And I also highly recommend that you listen to 2 podcast episodes that I got to be a guest on to talk about Podgagement. The first is Pod News Weekly Review with James Cridlin and Sam Sethi. Sam and I had a conversation about Podgagement. And then Dave Jackson from School of Podcasting invited me onto his podcast to talk about Podgagement as well. I have the links to those episodes in the notes for this episode, a tap or swipe away. And I highly recommend that you listen to those episodes and listen to those podcasts. Follow them, get their episodes. They're some of my favorites that I listen to as often as I can. The number 3 exciting announcement, and I might choke up a little bit about this one. I'm being inducted into the Podcast Hall of Fame. This announcement has been burning a hole in my drafts for several weeks, but they said I couldn't announce it until the press release, which was somehow delayed. But it finally came out this week, and I am so honored, so honored that both I'm speechless and I have a head full of things I want to say and people I want to thank. It's such a huge honor. And I don't say that to brag or anything like that, but to be inducted into the Podcast Hall of Fame, to be in there among other podcasting giants who have helped shape the technology of the industry, help shape what the industry can do, as well as help trailblaze and set certain trends in the industry. Like the first music podcaster, the first podcaster who did this, who started this whole thing and these things. This is a huge honor that I did not expect to happen. And I do not take it lightly at all. It's so encouraging, so rewarding, so affirming. And I better not try and do a speech right now because I will cry. This award ceremony will be held at the 10th anniversary Podfest Expo in Orlando. So I will be there. I can't be there for the whole conference. I have to leave Saturday morning of that conference, but I will be there the days before Saturday. And the award ceremony is that Friday night. So I hope that you can make it. Please be there. I would love for you to sit at my table with me, but I do not have that big of a table. And some of my family will even be there. That it's just an incredible blessing that they would be in the Orlando area anyway. So they're going to be able to come to see me inducted into the Podcast Hall of Fame. I am really excited, honored, and humbled, and just so excited about this. I hope you can be there to celebrate with me. So please make it to Podfest. Excellent podcasting conference too, by the way. I highly recommend Podfest Expo, and I've been so disappointed to miss Podfest Expo for the last several years because I was in a position where I could only choose one podcasting conference to go to at all, if even that. I couldn't go to any last year, actually. But I'll be able to make it to Podfest Expo, and I hope to see you there. Thank you so much if you were able to support me in that. And you'll get to hear so much more in my speech and some of the story that I'm going to share of podcasting, some things that I haven't said before, and a lot of people who really inspired me. I hope that they get to hear their names mentioned there too. So make it to Podfest Expo if you can, especially even if you can only come for the Podcast Hall of Fame ceremony. I would love to see you there. And before I go, a little personal aside. If you followed me for a while, you know that the last few years have been very difficult for me, both personally and professionally. There have been many ups and downs, and I would start to rebuild on apparent stability in life, but then something would radically change and shake up everything again, and I'd have to rebuild again, or I'd feel like I'd have to rebuild in certain ways, sometimes professionally, sometimes personally, sometimes emotionally. It was just difficult. So I see these 3 big wins, the Podcast Awards, finally launching Podgagement, and especially the Podcast Hall of Fame. I see them as amazing and totally unmerited blessings from God and huge motivators for me to keep going, helping you to have the audacity to podcast. So now with both the rush of working to launch Podgagement, since I've been working on it for so long, and especially this 2023, Podgagement was kind of like the thing, the only thing I could work on that year, and worked very late nights, many very late nights trying to finish that. I'm so excited to finally have that launched. So having that now out of the way, the launch of that, now I'm in the feature enhancement mode where I can build on top of that foundation. And the changing stability in my fatherhood responsibilities has also now seemingly moved to a steady place that I'm happy with. I'm ready and eager to get back to regular podcast episodes. So you're going to hear the Audacity to Podcast again, back with the episode about how to refresh your podcast branding and the episode about what to do when you have duplicate listings of your podcast in Apple Podcasts, since that's a complicated mess. And don't do anything until you hear that episode. And much more to come in the future because I've got so much still I want to teach you and inspire you in podcasting. So I am not done with the Audacity to Podcast, and I hope you're not done with it either. And if you've been missing me, by the way, for the last few months, have you checked out the Future of Podcasting that I've been co-hosting quite consistently with Dave Jackson? Instead of focusing on the how or the in-depth stuff like I do here in the Audacity to Podcast, The future of podcasting's focus is right there in the title, the future of podcasting. We discuss what's coming in the industry and why and how you can take advantage of the industry-leading innovations. You might have tried listening to the Podcasting 2.0 podcast, which I do highly recommend, but it can get really technical sometimes. So technical that it's even over my head over some of the stuff that they're talking about that I feel like either I don't want to try and learn, or it's going to be really difficult for me to try and learn that stuff or try and figure out what they're talking about. We don't go that deep with the future of podcasting. Instead, we might sometimes talk about some of the technical stuff, but we really want to focus on why does this matter and what can you do with this? And one of the things, our last episode of 2023, I highly recommend that you check out is, while everyone else is probably making their predictions of what's coming in podcasting in 2024, we did something different. We shared our hopes for 2024, not predictions. We're not going to say, we predict this will happen. Instead, we said, we hope this will happen. This is what we want to see happen in the podcasting industry in 2024 and beyond. So I really hope that you'll listen to that episode and follow that podcast too, The Future of Podcasting, because Dave and I have a lot of fun with that. We talk back and forth, we get geeky, then we bring it back to earth, and I think you will enjoy it too. That's over at futureofpodcasting.net. We've had several episodes, even though I couldn't do the Audacity to podcast consistently, I've been able to do that podcast more consistently. So I hope you check that out and listen to it regularly too. So these three things I'm so excited about: winning a podcast award, having Podgagement launched. I hope you check it out. Try it out yourself. See if you like it for engaging your audience and growing your podcast, and being inducted into the Podcast Hall of Fame. I hope you can make it there to Podfest Expo and at least the Podcast Hall of Fame ceremony to celebrate both with me and with everyone else who is being inducted into the Podcast Hall of Fame. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you for keeping me in your podcast app. So now that the Audacity to Podcast is back, I'm going to be giving you more guts and teaching you more tools so that you can start and grow your own podcast for passion and profit. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from theaudacitytopodcast.com. Thanks for listening.